hundreds of people might have been witnesses to it. And so I think that this is a very troubling act to Caiaphas and his council, and it signaled to them that Jesus was dangerous. Perhaps the best way to put the dangerousness is to say this: if he would do that, we don't know what he will do next. The man may be uncontrollable. But what do you do with a man who is uncontrollable, who is charismatic, who has a following? You stop him.
Stopping Jesus was exactly what Caiaphas set out to do. He called a secret meeting of the chief priests at his house in the Old City. Matthew's Gospel says Caiaphas urged them to take action. Jesus must be killed. They argued about how and when. If they killed Jesus now, at Passover, there could well be massive riots in the city. Whatever their discussions, we know that Caiaphas decided to strike. It is the middle of the night. The streets of Jerusalem are deserted. The crowds are all at home, celebrating Passover. He can do it secretly and swiftly. After their own supper, Jesus is praying while his disciples rest in the Garden of Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. He is interrupted by the arrival of a detachment of temple guards sent to arrest him. Caiaphas could argue in his defense that arresting Jesus was perfectly legal. He had simply brought in a known rebel who was endangering the public peace. Hardly the actions of a murder suspect. Caiaphas then put Jesus on trial. But experts believe that at this point, Caiaphas leaves the law behind. In legal terms, the so-called trial is a sham.
The whole Jewish trial of Jesus, as it's presented in the Gospels, is a complete travesty of justice. We know something about Jewish trials at the time from later Jewish writings known as the Mishnah, and they give us a fairly comprehensive idea of how trials ought to be run. And nearly everything in Jesus' trial is illegal. It takes place at night, which was illegal. It takes place not in the normal council chamber, but in the high priest's house. It takes place on a feast day, which was also not allowed.
The only sources we have for what took place at the trial are the four Gospels. They do vary, but they reinforce the suspicion that what took place that night was not entirely above board.
Caiaphas will serve as both the chief judge and the prosecuting attorney. This is the general role taken by the person who convenes a court. And the judges are there to give a kind of cover, so he can say, well, it was a proper trial. So he had this rather sneaky nighttime trial with whatever close allies he wanted to call in.
Caiaphas believed he had a case against Jesus. He arrested him because he had threatened to destroy the temple, an offense against God and treason against the state. Jesus would stand accused of blasphemy and sedition. The trouble was, he needed witnesses. The Bible says that Caiaphas produced witnesses who claimed they had heard Jesus saying he would destroy the temple. Under Jewish law, at least 2 male witnesses had to agree, and very nearly word for word. But the witnesses contradicted each other. They contradicted themselves. In some confusion, they were dismissed. The charge of sedition had failed. Caiaphas now had a problem.
His problem was simple. I want him killed. The witnesses didn't work out. We had him. We had him. He threatened to destroy the temple. That's what he actually did. Turning over the tables, that's what he did, that it makes him such a dangerous man. That's why we've got to get rid of him. Whatever he says, I'm going to say he deserves death. And convening a trial and going through the pretense just gives a legal cover. I held a trial, he can later say. I never execute someone arbitrarily.
Without witnesses, Caiaphas had to change tack. If he could provoke Jesus to say something blasphemous, he would have him for breaking Jewish law. He asked Jesus point blank, "Are you the Son of God, the Son of the Blessed? Are you the Messiah?" Here the Gospels vary a little, and only in Mark's account does Jesus answer that he is. Caiaphas declared that Jesus had spoken blasphemy. The other members of his court agreed. The penalty for this was death.
I think it didn't matter what Jesus answered precisely. Caiaphas, when he decided to arrest him, had decided to execute him.
The case against Caiaphas seems unanswerable. He arrests Jesus, tries him in a kangaroo court, and convicts him on a religious charge. There is just one small problem. Judea is under the iron rule of the Romans. Caiaphas is not permitted to execute a death sentence. So Caiaphas had the motive, but not the power. In the end, no matter how much he wanted Jesus dead, he couldn't deliver. The case against Caiaphas is a strong one. But to find out who really killed Jesus, we'll have to look elsewhere. Judea, in the time of Jesus, is a Jewish province governed by the Roman Empire. All power, including that of life and death, is vested in one man, the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Pilate has 6,000 crack troops at his command. Up the road, in Syria, a further 30,000 soldiers are on call to back him up.
Rome had actually only been ruling Judea directly for the last 25 years by the time of Jesus, and so the control was still fairly tenuous and uncertain. So Pilate's main job is to make sure that law and order prevails in Judea.
If there's an obvious suspect anywhere in the killing of Jesus, it's Pontius Pilate. Pilate was the man who sent Jesus to be crucified. He has got to be the prime suspect. In the Bible, Pilate is made out to be innocent in the death of Jesus. But this may not be the whole story. In fact, all the evidence from sources outside the Bible paints a picture of a very different man. According to the historian Philo, writing at the time, Pilate was calculating, cruel, and often brutal. He also had an intense dislike of Jews. So much so that he based his headquarters here in the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean coast and not in the Jewish capital, Jerusalem. Caesarea was 60 miles from Jerusalem, a good 2.5 days' march.
Pontius Pilate seems to have been arrogant, brash, and particularly insensitive in his treatment of the Jews. He probably had a typical Roman's disdain for any other culture, probably thinking that they weren't anything like as civilized as the Romans themselves.
But Pilate could not avoid his annual visit to Jerusalem for Passover. As Roman governor of Judea, it was part of his official duty to attend the most important festival in the Jewish calendar. To make his trip more bearable, Pilate took his wife with him to Jerusalem. Even so, there would have been a lot on his mind.
Pilate would have been particularly concerned about the preservation of law and order at the Passover. This was a great national feast that commemorated the time when the Israelites came out of Egypt into the Holy Land, brought there by God, shaking off foreign oppression. And so, of course, it was natural that at the time of the Passover, people started to think about Roman overlords. They started to think about nationality. They thought about foreign oppressors. And it's no accident whatsoever that nearly all of the riots that we hear about in the first century took place at Passover. So if there's going to be a Jewish revolt, it's almost certain to happen here in Jerusalem, quite probably in the temple. And if anything threatened to disturb the peace, Pilate would have stamped it out straight away.
Pilate had an extensive network of spies and informers right across the city. He would have known about Jesus and the following that he was gaining, and about some kind of incident in the temple. And now, the trial that Caiaphas had held only the night before, with its sentence of death. It is now just after sunrise on the morning after the trial. Caiaphas had sent Jesus to appear before Pilate because only the Roman governor could carry out a death sentence. Pilate was well known for having executed prisoners even without trial, but little would have prepared him for the strange case of Jesus of Nazareth. The charge which Caiaphas had brought against Jesus was blasphemy, a Jewish crime, and nothing to do with Roman law. But overnight, the charge had disappeared.
There would have been no reason for Caiaphas to mention blasphemy one way or the other. He didn't have to say anything about that at all because he had a perfectly good accusation to bring against Jesus that Pilate would listen to in a minute. Namely, Jesus was guilty of sedition. Jesus thought, or his followers thought, or people said that he was the king of the Jews. That would make him guilty of a very high crime against Rome, and that would get him killed very quickly.
This is alarming for Pilate. The case now has legal meaning under Roman law. It is a charge of sedition and treason, punishable by death. Pilate must take action and, at the very least, give Jesus a hearing. Roman trials were often held in public. A crowd began to gather in the fevered atmosphere of Passover Jerusalem as news spread that Jesus of Nazareth was on trial for his life. Pilate now asked Jesus if he was calling himself King of the Jews. Jesus made little or no reply. Pilate could find no evidence against Jesus and said, "This man is innocent." At this point, Pilate could have dismissed the case, but he had to take into account an unexpected factor: the crowd. His verdict of innocence angered them. They began to shout for Jesus to be crucified. It's quite possible that the crowd was a mob, whipped up by the chief priests to put pressure on Pilate. Pilate now faced a dilemma. Release Jesus, and there may well be riots. But why should he execute an innocent man?
Pilate is in a bit of a cleft stick because All that we know from him, from other sources as well as the Gospels, like the historian Josephus who writes about him, make it clear that Pilate really didn't care about offending people. And actually, when he looked at Jesus and read the reports that he'd had from his officials, it was quite clear Jesus wasn't leading a military